For most of human history, people believed life was designed, fixed, purposeful, eternal. They looked at the world, at the wings of a bird, at the roots of a tree, at the strange machinery of their own hands, and they saw intention. They saw a plan. They saw the signature of something greater than themselves, and that belief was not a weakness. It was not ignorance. It was the most reasonable conclusion a human being could reach after a lifetime of observation. The world was too intricate, too layered, too precisely arranged to be anything other than made. This idea stretched back further than anyone could remember. Across cultures, across continents, across centuries, the same conclusion kept emerging. Life was given. Life was placed here. Each creature was shaped for a purpose, assigned its role, fitted into a system that was complete from the very beginning. The fish was made for water, the bird for the sky, the human being for dominion over the earth. Everything had its position. Everything had its meaning, and the order of things was not something men had invented. It was something they had merely discovered. That is a comforting belief, a powerful one. It meant that suffering had a reason, that the world was not random, that death was not simply an ending. Meaning was everywhere, embedded in creation itself. You could look at the smallest insect and trust that it was not an accident. You could face the darkest night and believe that something purposeful lay behind it. This was not just religion. It was science. It was philosophy. It was the universal assumption of the most educated men in the world. Even those who studied nature most closely, the naturalists, the botanists, the anatomists, they studied it to understand the design, not to question whether design existed. It did not need to be questioned. And then one man, quiet, careful, troubled, suggested something else. Not violently, not loudly. He did not storm into a lecture hall. He did not declare war on God or tradition or the natural philosophers who had come before him. He simply looked. He looked at the world more carefully than almost anyone had before him. He collected specimens. He took notes. He observed patterns that others had noticed but never followed to their conclusion. He spent years sitting with an idea that frightened him before he could bring himself to say it out loud. The idea was this: what if life was not created as it is, but shaped over time? What if species were not fixed? What if the fish had not always been a fish? What if the wing had not always been a wing? What if everything alive on Earth had arrived at its current form through a slow, invisible, relentless process? A process with no plan, no intention, no author. What if the world was not made? What if it simply became? This is the story of that idea, of the man who carried it for years, terrified of what it would mean, of the world that heard it and reacted with horror, with fury, with grief, of the long, slow, incomplete process by which it reshaped everything: science, philosophy, religion, medicine, our understanding of who and what we are. It is also the story of something that cannot be undone, because an idea, once it exists in the world, does not disappear. It can be suppressed. It can be ignored. It can be argued against with passion and conviction. But it cannot be unmade. It lives. It spreads. It finds new minds. And once that idea exists, it cannot be undone. If you enjoy thoughtful, long-form stories about the people who changed how we see the world, consider subscribing. Before Darwin, the world was still. Not physically still. Animals moved. Rivers flowed. Seasons turned. But beneath all that motion, there was a deeper stillness. a conviction that the forms of life itself were not changing, that what existed now was what had always existed, that species were permanent. This was not an assumption people had to be taught. It was the conclusion they reached naturally, by simply looking around them. Dogs were dogs. Horses were horses. Sparrows were sparrows. You could look at ancient carvings from Egypt, thousands of years old, and recognize the animals in them immediately. The ibis, carved in stone 3,000 years ago, looked exactly like the ibis wading in the Nile today. Nothing had changed. To the educated mind of the early 19th century, that stability was not just a fact, it was evidence. It was evidence that each creature had been made once in a finished form, perfectly suited to its environment, perfectly designed. The field of natural history, what we might now call biology, was devoted almost entirely to cataloging this design. Scientists, called naturalists, spent their lives collecting specimens, insects pinned to boards, dried plants pressed between pages, bones cleaned and measured and described. The goal was not to understand change. Change was not considered possible. The goal was to understand the original design, to map the plan in all its detail. The most influential voice on this question was a man named William Paley. He was a theologian, not a scientist. But in 1802, he published an argument so elegant, so intuitive, that it became the dominant framework for educated thought on the subject. He called it the watchmaker argument. It went like this. Imagine you are walking across a field and you find a watch. You pick it up and examine it. The gears mesh perfectly. The spring winds tightly. Every part works in precise coordination with every other part to produce a single result. The ars, measurement of time. No one looking at this watch could conclude that it had assembled itself. The complexity of its parts, the precision of their interaction, these things can only be explained by a maker, by intention. Now, look at a living eye. Look at its lens, perfectly curved to focus light. Look at the retina, which receives that light and converts it into signals that can be interpreted by the brain. The eye is more intricate than any watch, more complex than any human machine. If a watch demands a watchmaker, what does an eye demand? A maker infinitely more skilled. This was not considered a leap of faith. It was considered a logical conclusion. The most careful students of nature were often the most devout, because the closer they looked, the more extraordinary the design appeared. Every new species discovered seemed to confirm the picture. Every organ examined in detail revealed new layers of precision. The world was not random. The world was made. And the order of that making was hierarchical. God at the top. Below God, the angels. Below the angels, human beings, created in God's image, endowed with reason, set apart from the rest of creation. Below humans, the animals, each ranked according to complexity. Below them, plants. Below plants, minerals and earth. This was called the Great Chain of Being. It was a picture of the universe as a ladder. Every rung occupied, every level distinct, every creature in its proper place. Movement between rungs was not merely unlikely, it was impossible. A dog could not become something other than a dog. A fish could not become something other than a fish. The boundaries between species were fixed by the same hand that had drawn them. This was the intellectual world into which Charles Darwin was born. It was a world that made sense. A world where every question about the natural order had, in principle, an answer. Even if the answer was simply, because that is how it was made. A world where human beings occupied a special position, a world where the complexity of life was not a problem to be solved, but a testament to be admired. The naturalists who studied that world were not blind men. They were some of the most careful observers in human history. Their collections were vast. Their measurements were precise. Their publications were meticulous. They knew the natural world in extraordinary detail. But there was one question they had agreed not to ask. Or rather, one question that never occurred to them to ask, because the answer seemed so obvious. Why are things this way? Not, what does this organ do? But, why does this organ exist? Not, what are the differences between these two species? But, where did those differences come from? The answer was always the same. They were made this way. The differences were put there. The design was given. There was no reason to question it. Charles Darwin was not supposed to be the one. He was not, as a young man, the kind of student who drew the attention of great thinkers. He was not disciplined. He was not burning with intellectual ambition. He did not wake before dawn to fill notebooks with theories. He was, by his own account, a mediocre student who preferred the outdoors to the classroom and the company of friends to the rigor of study. He was born into a comfortable family. His father, Robert Darwin, was a wealthy physician, large, formidable, and deeply practical. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had been a poet and naturalist of some renown, a man who had written in verse about the transformation of living things. But Charles did not inherit his grandfather's ambitions, or not yet. He inherited comfort and a certain freedom to drift. His father wanted him to study medicine. Charles tried. He went to Edinburgh at 16 to begin his medical training, and found it deeply unpleasant. The lectures were dull. The surgeries, performed in the era before anesthesia, were horrifying. He watched a child being operated on, screaming throughout, and left the room. He never went back. He did not, however, waste his time in Edinburgh. Away from the operating theaters, he found something that genuinely interested him. He joined a student natural history society. He collected marine creatures along the shoreline. He learned to stuff birds. He spent hours in the company of a man named John Edmonstone, a formerly enslaved person from South America who had come to Edinburgh and taught specimen preparation. And from him, Darwin received not only a technical education, but a vivid account of the South American rainforest that stayed with him for years. He was, it was becoming clear, a young man who came alive outdoors. A young man who noticed things, who found himself drawn to the detail of the natural world not for any theoretical reason, but because it was genuinely, deeply interesting to him. His father, watching him fail to become a doctor, redirected his ambitions. If not medicine, then the church. A country parson's life was, in early 19th century England, an honorable and comfortable one. Parsons often had time to pursue their interests, and many were serious naturalists. It was not an illogical suggestion. Charles went to Cambridge to prepare for ordination, and there, again, he did not shine academically, but he found his people. He became close to a botanist named John Stevens Henslow, a man of deep knowledge, quiet authority, and genuine enthusiasm for the natural world. Henslow took the young Darwin on botanical walks. He introduced him to serious naturalists. He lent him books. He encouraged him. He also introduced him to geology through the works of Adam Sedgwick, a man who studied rock formations and what they could reveal about the history of the earth. And here something shifted in Darwin. He went on a geological expedition to Wales, with Sedgwick, learning to read the land as a document, learning to see time written in stone. This was a different kind of seeing. Not just what is here, but how did this come to be here? Not just describing the world as it was, but asking how it had arrived at its present form. It was a question he would spend his life pursuing. But not yet. In the summer of 1831, Darwin returned from Wales to a letter from Henslow. A Royal Navy vessel, HMS Beagle, was preparing to depart on a surveying expedition to South America. The ship's captain, a young man named Robert Fitzroy, wanted a gentleman companion, someone educated, curious, willing to spend 2 years at sea cataloging the natural world of places that most British naturalists had never visited. Henslow thought of Darwin. His father objected. 2 years was a long time. The journey was uncertain. The purpose, natural history, was not exactly a career. And Charles was supposed to be preparing for ordination, not sailing, around the world. But Darwin's uncle intervened, persuading Robert Darwin to give his consent. And Charles, 22 years old, not yet a doctor, not yet a parson, not yet any particular thing, said yes. He was not looking for a revolution. He was not carrying a theory. He had no grand plan for overturning the intellectual order. He had, if anything, a deep and genuine faith in the design of the natural world. He had read Paley's watchmaker argument and found it convincing. He admired it. He simply wanted to see, and what he saw would take him a lifetime to understand. The Beagle left England on the 27th of December, 1831. Darwin was immediately, violently seasick. He lay in his hammock for days, unable to eat, retching through rough Atlantic swells. The ship was small, only 90 feet long, and the sea was enormous. He had dreamed of this journey. The reality was considerably less romantic. But the seasickness passed, and the world opened. The Beagle's mission was practical, to chart the coastlines of South America, to take depth soundings, to survey harbors. Fitzroy needed accurate maps. The Royal Navy needed accurate maps. Darwin was not the mission. He was a passenger. But he was a passenger with exceptional freedom and exceptional curiosity, and in the places where the Beagle anchored, he disappeared into the landscape. He rode across the pampas of Argentina on horseback. He hiked into the forests of Brazil. He dug through ancient shell beds on the coast of Patagonia. He watched gauchos hunt. He camped in places no European naturalist had studied. He collected everything: insects, birds, plants, fossils, shells, rocks, packing crate after crate and sending them back to Henslow in Cambridge. And as he collected, he began to notice things. The first thing he noticed was scale. The sheer, overwhelming abundance of life in the tropics was unlike anything he had been prepared for. England had its own beauty: hedgerows and moorland, and the precise, contained variety of a temperate island. But the South American rainforest was something else entirely. Layer upon layer of living things, in densities and varieties that seemed to mock any attempt at comprehension. He wrote to Henslow with barely contained excitement. He could not walk 10 feet without finding something new. The beetles alone were staggering. But it was not just the abundance that struck him. It was the pattern. He noticed that as the Beagle moved southward along the coast of South America, the animals changed. Not randomly, not chaotically. They changed in ways that tracked the landscape. Creatures in the north were different from creatures in the south, but they were recognizably related. as if some underlying type existed, and the details had shifted in response to the different conditions of different places. He saw this with the rayas, great flightless birds similar to ostriches that lived across the continent. The rhea of the north was a large, well-documented species. But in the south, around Patagonia, Darwin encountered a different rhea, smaller, with slightly different markings. They were clearly related, but they were not the same. Why? He didn't have an answer. But the question was there, lodged in the back of his mind. Then came the fossils. At a place called Punta Alta on the Argentine coast, Darwin dug into ancient cliff faces and found bones. Enormous bones. The bones of creatures that no longer existed, extinct species, preserved in ancient rock. He found a skull he identified as belonging to something like a giant armadillo. He found enormous teeth that had once belonged to a creature related to the modern horse, though horses, supposedly, were not native to the Americas. These were not small discoveries. They were extraordinary ones, but what made them significant was not just their size or their strangeness. It was their location. The fossils of extinct creatures were being found in the same places where their living relatives existed today. The giant armadillo had been found where armadillos still lived. The ancient horse relative had been found where other large grazers still roamed. The extinct forms and the living forms occupied the same geography. This seemed to Darwin too remarkable to be coincidence. But what did it mean? The orthodox answer was straightforward. Extinct creatures had been destroyed by catastrophes, floods, upheavals, and replaced by new creations. God had remade the world multiple times. Each major extinction was followed by a new act of creation. The creatures that existed today were simply the most recent batch. Darwin had no argument against this. Not yet. But the pattern nagged at him. Why would a creator replace an extinct creature with one so similar to it, in the same location? Why not something completely different? It was an uncomfortable question. He noted it and moved on. The Beagle crossed the Pacific. It stopped at various islands, and then, in September of 1835, it arrived at a small archipelago in the Pacific Ocean, roughly 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador. The Galapagos Islands. Darwin did not know when he arrived that these islands would become the most famous location in the history of science. He spent only 5 weeks there. He was already thinking of home. He did not, at the time, consider the islands his most important destination. But the world does not care about our expectations. It simply shows us what it shows us. The Galapagos were strange. They were volcanic islands, dark, barren, jagged. The rocks were black. The vegetation was sparse and unusual. Giant tortoises moved across the landscape with slow, prehistoric deliberateness. Marine iguanas, lizards that swam in the ocean and dived for algae, lay in piles on the rocks, basking. It was a world that felt both ancient and alien. Darwin collected, as he always did. He took specimens of the plants, the lizards, the birds. He noted that the tortoise shells differed slightly between islands, that a knowledgeable local could identify which island a tortoise had come from just by looking at its shell. He found this interesting, but he did not think deeply about it at the time. He also collected birds. Small, unremarkable birds, brown and black with varying beak shapes. He noted them, bagged them, and moved on to more obviously interesting creatures. It would be only later, back in England, when an ornithologist named John Gould examined those birds, that their significance would begin to emerge. Gould told Darwin something remarkable. The birds Darwin had assumed were different species, different families even, were not different families. They were all finches, related finches, from the same ancestral stock. But over time, on different islands, they had changed. Their beaks had changed. On one island, where food was found in flowers and fruit, the beaks were thin and pointed. On another island, where food was in hard seeds, the beaks were thick and powerful. On yet another, where food was under the bark of trees, the beak had become a tool for extraction. Same bird, different islands, different beaks, different lives. And here is what Darwin had to sit with. The Galapagos were young islands. They had risen from the ocean floor relatively recently, geologically speaking. They had been colonized by creatures from the South American mainland, blown there by storms, carried by currents. There had been no original design for Galapagos life. Life had arrived and then become something fitted to where it found itself. Darwin sat with this. He sat with the fossils from Argentina. He sat with the rheas, the large northern rhea and the smaller southern rhea, so similar yet so distinct. He sat with the tortoises, island by island, each subtly different. He sat with the pattern that kept recurring across the entire journey. Living things in a place are related to the extinct creatures of that place. Living things on an island are related to the creatures of the nearest mainland. When environments differ, even closely related creatures differ. What kind of explanation could account for all of this? The creation account said each species was made separately, placed where it is, fitted to its environment. But if that was true, why were Galapagos creatures so clearly related to South American creatures? Why hadn't God put something completely different on those islands? And why did the extinct creatures of Argentina so closely resemble the living ones, if extinction was followed by a fresh, independent creation? Something was wrong with the picture, or rather, something was missing from it. Darwin did not arrive home with a theory. He arrived home with a problem, a beautiful, disturbing problem. He had seen, with his own eyes, evidence that the natural world was not as fixed as anyone had claimed. Species were not simply placed. They were connected, to each other, to the past, to the landscape they inhabited. The links were there. You could trace them. But what was the mechanism? What was the force that produced these connections? What process, invisible and slow, was responsible for the differences between a northern rhea and a southern rhea? For the thick beak and the thin beak of the Galapagos finches? He did not yet know. He returned to England in October 1836. He was 27 years old. He had been away for nearly 5 years. He came home with thousands of specimens, dozens of notebooks, and a question burning at the center of everything. He did not know the answer, but he was beginning to suspect that when he found it, it would not be comfortable. The answer, when it came, was almost embarrassingly simple. Darwin began keeping a private notebook. He called it the Transmutation Notebook, in which he worked through the problem he had brought home from the beagle. He was thinking not just about what he had seen, but about what could explain it. He read widely. He talked to animal breeders, men who bred dogs, horses, pigeons. He talked to farmers and gardeners. And from those conversations, something clicked. Breeders had known for centuries what scientists had barely thought about. You could change an animal, not dramatically, not overnight, but over generations. By selecting which animals were allowed to breed, you could push a population in any direction you chose. Take pigeons. In the wild, pigeons were unremarkable birds, gray, common, practically identical. But in the hands of breeders, over generations of careful selection, pigeons had become fantastically varied. There were pigeons with enormous fantails, pigeons with tiny, tucked beaks, pigeons with feathered feet, pigeons that tumbled in the air, pigeons that looked nothing like each other, and yet were all, provably, pigeons. The breeder's tool was selection. He chose which birds to breed. He chose which traits to preserve. And over generations, those traits became more pronounced. The population shifted. Darwin stared at this for a long time. Now, remove the breeder. In nature, there is no human hand directing which creatures reproduce and which do not. But there is still selection. Not conscious selection, not intentional selection, but selection nonetheless. Here is the logic. Every living thing produces more offspring than can survive. A single fern releases thousands of spores. A single fish lays thousands of eggs. A single rabbit produces dozens of young in a lifetime. But the world does not fill up with ferns and fish and rabbits, because most of them die. Resources are limited. Predators exist. Disease exists. Drought and cold and competition exist. Most offspring die before they can reproduce themselves, but they do not all die equally. Living things are not identical. They vary. Some are slightly larger, slightly faster, slightly better camouflaged, slightly more resistant to a particular disease. These variations are small. In most circumstances, they are invisible. But in the competition to survive long enough to reproduce, small advantages matter. The creature that is even slightly better suited to its environment is slightly more likely to survive, slightly more likely to reproduce, slightly more likely to pass its traits to the next generation. Over time, not human time, but geological time, not years, but thousands and millions of years. Those slight advantages accumulate. The population shifts. The species changes, and if a population is separated by a mountain range, by an ocean, by an island, each group changes in response to its own conditions. They diverge. They become, eventually, distinct. Those that fit survive. Those that do not disappear. Darwin called this process natural selection. It required no plan, no intention, no creator. It required only three things that were undeniably, observably true. First, living things vary. This was not in dispute. Anyone who had ever looked at two members of the same species could see it. Second, some variations are inherited. This too was not in dispute. Offspring resemble their parents. Third, some variations give their possessors an advantage in surviving and reproducing. If all three were true, and they were, then natural selection was not a possibility. It was an inevitability. It had to happen. It could not happen. Given enough time and enough variation, populations would change. Species would change. Given enough time and enough separation, new species would emerge. The idea was devastating in its simplicity. There was no need for a moment of creation. There was no need for a divine hand to shape the wing or the eye or the beak of the finch. The wing had come from something that wasn't a wing. The eye had come from something that could barely sense light. The beak of the finch had shifted, millimeter by millimeter, generation by generation, in response to the food available on a particular island. All of it. Everything alive. Every form, every feature, every extraordinary intricacy that Paley had held up as evidence of a maker. All of it had arrived not through design, but through the long, slow, blind accumulation of small advantages. Darwin understood what he had, and it terrified him. The idea was clear. It was coherent. It was, Darwin believed, true, and it changed everything. Not just science, not just biology, everything. If life had not been designed, if every living form, including the human form, was the product of a blind mechanical process that responded to nothing except survival and reproduction, then certain other things followed. Things that were not comfortable to consider. The first was about God. Not about whether God existed. Darwin was not prepared to make that leap, but about God's role. If natural selection explained the origin of species, then the Creator, if there was one, had not been hands-on, had not shaped the wing or the eye directly, had not placed each creature in its proper home. Whatever role remained for God was much reduced from what the theologians had claimed. Paley's watchmaker became, at best, a watchmaker who had set the clock running and then walked away. For many people, that was no watchmaker at all. The second consequence was about human beings, and this one was harder. If natural selection applied to all life, and Darwin saw no reason why it should not, then it applied to humans too. Humans were not separate from nature. They were part of it. The human body was not uniquely designed. It had evolved from something else. The human eye, which Paley had held up as the supreme example of divine craftsmanship, was the product of the same slow, blind process that had shaped the eye of the squid and the eye of the spider. And if human bodies had evolved, then what about human minds? What about reason and conscience and the sense of beauty and the love of music and the capacity for prayer? Were these also the products of natural selection? Were they advantages that had accumulated over time because they helped creatures survive and reproduce? What did that do to the idea of the soul? Darwin sat with these questions. He was not a cruel man. He was not trying to destroy anything. He was not anti-religious. He had prepared for ordination. He attended church. He had married a deeply devout woman named Emma Wedgwood. He did not want to cause pain. But he could see with uncomfortable clarity what his idea implied. It implied that the story human beings had told themselves, the story of special creation, of meaning written into the fabric of existence, of humanity's unique and elevated place in the order of things, was not true. Or rather, it was not how things had happened. Human beings were not the purpose of creation. They were one more variation in a long, branching chain of life that had no purpose at all, no direction, no goal, no end point. They had not been placed here. They had, in the same slow, blind way as everything else alive, simply arrived, and before them had come something that was not human, and before that, something that was not quite that. And if you followed the chain far enough back, far enough into the deep past, into the time, recorded in the rocks, you would reach something small and simple and without a mind, something that did not know it existed. This was the implication of the idea. Darwin saw it. He did not enjoy seeing it. He wrote to a friend years later that working on this felt like confessing to a murder. What if this idea destroys more than it explains? Darwin did not publish. Not in 1837 when the idea first took shape. Not in 1838. Not in 1839. Not for years after that. He worked. He was always working. He corresponded with naturalists around the world. He studied barnacles, the tiny, unglamorous creatures that cling to rocks and ships' hulls, for 8 years, building an expertise so painstaking and thorough that it became a masterpiece of natural history in its own right. He managed his household. He raised his children. He suffered from a chronic, debilitating illness whose cause was never clearly identified. Headaches, vomiting, exhaustion, that forced him to limit his working hours and retreat frequently to bed. But the idea sat at the center of everything. He added to it, refined it, gathered evidence. He wrote notes that no one else saw. He understood, with increasing certainty, that what he had was not a rough sketch but a complete argument, a theory of life. Still, he did not publish. Why? There was, first, the professional risk. Darwin was a respected naturalist. His work on the Beagle voyage had established him. He had credibility. If he published a theory this radical and it was wrong, or worse, if it was right but dismissed, ridiculed, destroyed by the weight of opposition, he would lose everything he had built. He was cautious. He wanted the evidence to be overwhelming before he moved. There was the personal risk. His wife Emma was a woman of deep Christian faith. She worried, quietly and persistently, about the implications of his thinking, not just for the world, but for his soul. He knew that publishing would hurt her. He was not willing to do that without certainty. And there was something harder to name, a sense that once the idea was in the world, things could not go back, that some understanding, once released, could not be recalled. He would be the man who had said it. He would be responsible for what followed. He was also, beneath all of this, uncertain. Not about the logic of natural selection that he was sure of, but about the gaps. He knew that critics would ask, where are the transitional forms? If species changed gradually, where were the fossils of creatures halfway between one form and another? He knew they would ask about the eye. How could something as complex as an eye develop through small, gradual steps? He knew they would ask about instinct, about behavior, about the sterility of hybrid species. He wanted answers before he opened the door. So he waited. And the world waited without knowing it was waiting. The most dangerous ideas are often kept quiet the longest. In June of 1858, a letter arrived at Darwin's home in the English countryside. It came from Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was a very different kind of man from Darwin. He had not come from wealth. He had not attended Cambridge. He had worked as a surveyor and a schoolteacher before becoming a naturalist, a self-funded one, which meant he survived by selling specimens to collectors. He was extraordinary in his own right, a rigorous observer, a fearless traveler, a genuinely original thinker. He had spent years in the rainforests of South America and then the islands of Southeast Asia, the Malay Archipelago, as it was then known. He had collected tens of thousands of specimens. He had made careful observations about the distribution of species across islands, and he had arrived, independently, at the same question Darwin had been asking. The letter contained an essay. The essay described a mechanism for the origin of species, for the divergence of living things over time, for the survival of those best fitted to their conditions and the disappearance of those that were not. It was natural selection, not Darwin's words, not Darwin's examples, but the same idea reached by the same logic. Darwin read the letter and felt what he later described as a kind of shock. 20 years. 20 years he had worked on this. 20 years of evidence and refinement and anxiety and delay. and now a man working independently, half a world away, had reached the same conclusion. He wrote immediately to his friends Charles Lyell, a geologist, and Joseph Hooker, a botanist. Both men were among the very few who knew the content of Darwin's private work. He told them about the letter. He asked what he should do. The answer they gave him was both practical and complex. They arranged with some speed for Darwin's earlier writings on the subject, letters and a sketch of his theory from previous years, to be presented alongside Wallace's essay at a meeting of the Linnean Society in London. Both men would receive credit. Priority would be shared. Wallace was not consulted. He was still in Asia. He had no idea this was happening. When he later found out, he was, remarkably, not angry. He was generous about it, even gracious. He spent the rest of his life referring to natural selection as Darwinism, insisting that Darwin had earned the primary credit through the depth and scope of his evidence. But for Darwin, in the summer of 1858, the lesson was clear. He could wait no longer. If he had hesitated because he wanted to be sure, he was sure. If he had hesitated because he feared to be wrong, someone else had now independently confirmed the logic. If he had hesitated because he feared the reaction, well, the reaction would come whether he was ready for it or not. He had 13 months. He sat down to write what would become the most consequential book in the history of biology. The clock, at last, was running. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection was published on the 24th of November, 1859. The first edition consisted of 1,250 copies. They sold out in a single day. Darwin had written the book under pressure. Quickly, by his standards, though it was still a dense and carefully argued 500-page work. He had been unwell during much of the writing. He suffered his usual symptoms. He worked when he could, and rested when he had to, and the manuscript took shape in that halting, determined way. The book was not a polemic. It was not a provocation. Darwin was, by temperament, a man who avoided confrontation. The book read like what it was, the patient accumulation of evidence by a careful scientist who had thought about a problem for 20 years, and was now, as methodically as possible, laying out what he had found. He began with variation, the simple, observable fact that living things are not identical. He moved to the idea of competition and differential survival. He explained natural selection step by step, using analogies the reader could grasp. The pigeon breeder, the farmer selecting his crops. He addressed the objections he had anticipated, the absence of transitional fossils, the complexity of the eye, the problem of instinct. And then, near the end, almost gently, he introduced the implication that hovered over the whole argument. He wrote, "Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." He did not dwell on it. He did not explain what he meant. He let the reader understand. The reaction was immediate. It was large. It was various. Some readers understood immediately and found it liberating. Here, at last, was a mechanism that could explain the whole of life without recourse to miracle. Geologists and some naturalists had already accepted that the earth was old, far older than the biblical account allowed. Darwin's theory provided a framework for what had happened in all that time. It was, for those who were ready for it, not a destruction but an explanation. Thomas Henry Huxley, a biologist who would become Darwin's most ferocious public defender, read the book and reportedly said, "How extremely stupid not to have thought of that." But others read the same book and felt something closer to grief or rage. The Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, known as Soapy Sam for his rhetorical smoothness, prepared a detailed counter-argument. A review appeared in the Quarterly Review that ran to nearly 50 pages, picking apart Darwin's evidence and defending the fixed creation of species. Darwin read the attacks from his home. He was not well enough to attend the debates that erupted in London's lecture halls and scientific societies. He had always known they were coming. He had spent 20 years preparing answers. But knowing they were coming and experiencing them were not the same thing. The idea was now in the world, and the world was not calm about it. The most famous confrontation came in June of 1860, 7 months after publication. It took place at Oxford during the annual meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce was scheduled to speak. Huxley was in the audience. So were hundreds of others, scientists, clergy, students, curious members of the public who had heard that something was going to happen. Wilberforce spoke for half an hour. He was eloquent, cutting, methodical. He attacked Darwin's theory on scientific grounds, the absence of transitional forms, the problem of explaining complex organs through gradual change, and then turned to what he considered the deeper absurdity. He asked, famously, whether Huxley claimed his descent from an ape on his grandfather's side or his grandmother's side. It was meant to be devastating, a reduction of Darwin's theory to its most ridiculous implication, a reminder that the theory demanded we accept as our ancestors creatures that crawled and scratched. Huxley reportedly turned to the man beside him and said quietly, "God has delivered him into my hands." He stood and replied. He addressed Wilberforce's scientific points one by one, and then he said, and the exact wording varies by account, that he would rather have an ape for a grandfather than a man who used great gifts to suppress truth. The room, reportedly, erupted. A woman fainted. Arguments broke out across the hall. The meeting descended into chaos. This exchange became legendary, a turning point in the public battle between science and religion. But it was also, in important ways, a distortion. The debate was not simply science versus religion. Many deeply religious men accepted Darwin's theory. Many scientists rejected it. The lines were not clean. What the backlash really expressed was fear. Fear of meaninglessness. Fear of the unknown. Fear of a world in which human beings were not special. Because that is what the theory implied, taken to its logical conclusion. Not that God did not exist. Darwin himself remained agnostic, not atheist, for most of his life. But that the cosmos did not have human beings as its goal. That the universe was not arranged for our benefit. That our intelligence, our morality, our consciousness, these were not gifts from above. They were the accumulated results of millions of years of survival pressure. This was not a comfortable idea for anyone. Even those who accepted the theory often tried to soften it. They spoke of evolution as a kind of progress, a march from the simple to the complex, from the primitive to the sophisticated, with humanity at the pinnacle. Evolution as a staircase, with humans at the top. Darwin himself was uncomfortable with this reading. He did not see evolution as progress. He saw it as change driven by local conditions, with no direction and no endpoint. A creature perfectly adapted to its environment was not more evolved than any other. It was simply fitted to where it was. But the staircase version was easier to live with. and so that version persisted in popular understanding long after Darwin had tried to correct it. The fear of what the idea truly meant would outlast the argument about whether the idea was true. Let us be slow about this, because the real implications of Darwin's idea are still, over 160 years later, being worked out. Not everyone has caught up. Not every conversation has taken them on board. And some of the loudest reactions, both for and against, have misunderstood the theory in ways that matter. What did Darwin actually claim? He claimed that life changes over time, that species are not fixed, that the forms of life we observe today are the products of a continuous process of modification, driven by the differential survival and reproduction of individuals within populations. He did not claim that evolution has a direction. He did not claim that humans are the goal or pinnacle of anything. He did not claim that evolution produces progress, or that stronger species are better than weaker ones, or that survival implies moral superiority. These misreadings came later. They were added by others, often with disastrous consequences. The idea that evolution justified hierarchy among human groups, that some races were more evolved than others, was a catastrophic distortion. It found its most monstrous form in the eugenics movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and their consequences included policies of forced sterilization, discrimination, and eventually the ideology of Nazi Germany. Darwin was not responsible for these applications. His theory described what happened in nature. It made no claims about what should happen in human societies. The leap from descriptive to prescriptive, from this is how nature works to this is how we should organize ourselves, was a logical error. But it was an error with enormous reach and terrible consequences. What the theory actually meant, stripped of its distortions, was something more subtle and more profound. It meant that life is a process, not a state. That what we observe at any given moment is not a finished form, but a snapshot of something in motion. That the creatures, alive today, are connected, by an unbroken chain of descent, to every other creature that has ever lived on earth. It meant that humans are part of nature, not managers of it, not set apart from it, not elevated above it by some categorical difference. We are, in the language of biology, animals. We belong to the family of great apes. We share common ancestors with the chimpanzee, the gorilla, the orangutan. We share a common ancestor, deeper back, with every mammal. Deeper still with every vertebrate. Deeper still with every living thing on Earth. This was and remains the most startling claim in Darwin's theory. Not that species change, but that all life is one, that the tree of life is real, that every organism alive today is a cousin, near or distant, of every other, that the bacteria in your gut are your relatives, that the sequoia tree and the blue whale and the house sparrow and the mushroom on your lawn all share a common origin. This is not metaphor. It is not poetry. It is one of the most solidly supported conclusions in the history of science, and it changes how you see everything. It means that extinction is not just sad, but irreversible. A species that disappears is a branch of the tree of life, severed. The information encoded in its genome, the record of millions of years of evolution, the accumulated solutions to millions of problems, is gone. It cannot be recovered. It means that the diversity of life is not decorative. It is structural. A world with fewer species is a world with fewer options, fewer tools, less resilience. Humans are not at the center. We are part of the web. and what we do to the web, we do to ourselves. Biology, after Darwin, was never the same. That is not a dramatic claim. It is simply accurate. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection provided biology with something it had lacked, a unifying framework. Before Darwin, biology was a collection of descriptions, detailed, sophisticated, sometimes extraordinary, but disconnected. Each species was studied on its own terms. The connections between species were noticed but not explained. After Darwin, every observation in biology had a context. The structure of a bone could be understood in terms of what it had evolved from. The behavior of an animal could be understood in terms of what survival pressures had shaped it. The similarity between species could be understood as evidence of common descent. The great biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky would later write that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. He was right. Darwin's theory is not one idea among many in biology. It is the organizing principle of the entire field. In the decades after publication, the theory developed. Weaknesses were addressed. Gaps were filled. The largest gap initially was the mechanism of inheritance. Darwin knew that traits were passed from parents to offspring, but he did not know how. He could not explain, at the molecular level, what was actually being transmitted. He proposed various mechanisms, some of which turned out to be wrong. The answer had already been discovered by a monk named Gregor Mendel, working in a monastery garden in what is now the Czech Republic. Mendel had, in the 1860s, worked out the basic rules of genetic inheritance, dominance and recessiveness, the discrete units of heredity that we now call genes. His work was published but ignored for decades. When it was rediscovered at the turn of the 20th century, it seemed at first to contradict Darwin. Mendel's discrete genes didn't match Darwin's picture of gradual, continuous change. But by the 1940s, mathematicians and biologists had worked out how to reconcile them. The modern synthesis, as it was called, merged natural selection with genetic inheritance into a unified theory that remains the foundation of modern biology. Then came the discovery of DNA. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick, building on the X-ray work of Rosalind Franklin, described the double helix structure of deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is the molecule that carries genetic information. It is the code that determines the structure of proteins, and through proteins, the structure of organisms. And its structure immediately explained both how traits are inherited and how they can mutate. Evolution, it turned out, was written in chemistry. The mechanism Darwin had lacked was there, in every cell of every living thing, in four-letter code. The impact of Darwin's theory moved beyond biology. In philosophy, it raised questions about the basis of ethics and meaning that are still being argued over. If human values evolved, what is their status? Are they objective truths or adaptive fictions? Can we derive moral obligations from a picture of the world as a blind process of survival and reproduction? In psychology, Darwin's influence generated fields of study devoted to understanding human behavior in evolutionary terms. Why we form attachments, why we fear certain things, why we cooperate, why we compete. In medicine, evolution became the framework for understanding disease. Pathogens evolve. Antibiotics create selection pressure. Bacteria that survive become resistant. The rise of antibiotic resistance is evolution by natural selection, observable in real time, with real consequences for human life. Even in religion, the impact was profound. Many religious traditions have found ways to accommodate evolution, to see the process of natural selection not as the absence of God, but as the mechanism through which a creator chose to work. Others have not. The debate continues, and it is not always the same debate it was in 1860. The world after Darwin is a different world. Not because Darwin changed reality, but because he changed what we are able to see. Darwin died in April of 1882. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, not far from Isaac Newton, the man who had, according to his critics, demoted humanity from its special place in creation, was given one of the most honored resting places in the English-speaking world, somewhere between irony and vindication. He had spent his final years as he had spent most of his adult life, working quietly, methodically, on the things that interested him. He studied worms, the humble earthworm, which he argued played an enormous role in shaping the soil and therefore the landscape. The work was careful and beautiful and completely characteristic. He never stopped being curious. He never stopped noticing. The idea he left behind was not finished. He had not intended it to be. He had provided a framework, one he knew was incomplete, that had gaps he could not fill. He had offered it as the best explanation available. He had always expected it to be refined. And it was. The modern synthesis, the discovery of DNA, the sequencing of genomes, the mapping of evolutionary relationships through molecular evidence, the fossil record, which has continued to expand, filling in gaps that Darwin's critics pointed to as fatal weaknesses. Every decade has added detail. Every decade has confirmed the central claim. The idea is still here, not as a theory waiting to be overturned, as a fact as well established as any in science, more deeply confirmed with more lines of evidence converging upon it than almost any other conclusion in the history of human inquiry. Evolution is happening right now. In the bacteria in your body, evolving resistance to antibiotics. In the birds adapting to urban environments. In the viruses shifting their surface proteins to evade immune systems. In the insects developing resistance to pesticides. The process does not pause. It does not complete itself. It continues. You are part of it. Every human being alive is a temporary form, a snapshot in a process that began long before the first animal, long before the first cell, and will continue long after our species is gone. We are not the end of the story. We are not even near the middle. That is, depending on who you are, either terrifying or magnificent. Darwin himself seemed to find it magnificent. He ended on the origin of species with one of the most famous passages in all of scientific literature. He wrote of life being breathed into a few forms or one, and from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. It is a sentence that rewards rereading, not just for its elegance, but for what it contains. Endless forms, not one form, perfected and fixed. Not a single ladder with a single pinnacle. Endless forms, branching, diversifying, filling every available space with something new. Most beautiful and most wonderful, not in spite of having no plan. Not despite being the product of a blind process, but just beautiful, wonderful. Darwin had looked at the world for 50 years, at its fossils and its living forms, at its pigeons and its barnacles and its finches, and he had found it, in the end, not diminished by his understanding of it, but deepened. That is what the greatest ideas do. They do not make the world smaller. They make it larger, more connected, more strange, more worthy of attention. The idea is still here, spreading, growing, being extended into corners of knowledge Darwin never anticipated. And once it was seen, it could never be unseen. If you enjoy these long, thoughtful explorations of history and ideas, subscribe for more.